Resident Evil.
If you asked a fan what Resident Evil game is the best, most would likely say Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 4, both of which are very valid choices. They're both amazing games that have had an impact in their own various different ways, but pretty much every Resident Evil game has its own fanbase. Yes, even Resident Evil 6. But there is one that I feel like gets swept under the rug a lot, and that game is Resident Evil Revelations 2. Revelations 2 is the second installment in the Revelations series of Resident Evil games. The Revelations games are spin-offs that take place in between the main timeline of games. Revelations 1 takes place after RE4 but before RE5, and Revelations 2 takes place after RE5 but before RE6. And think of them more like an anthology series. Revelations 1 and Revelations 2 are a part of the same series, but Revelations 2 isn't a sequel to Revelations 1. They're both their own standalone stories. Revelations 2 specifically being based around Claire Redfield and Barry Burton, with each of them having their own supporting characters. Claire has Moira and Barry has Natalia, all of them being pretty likable characters in their own way. Barry specifically stands out to me a lot. He's easily my favorite character in this whole game, and I loved seeing his relationship with Moira. Moira is actually Barry's daughter, but the two don't have the best of relationships. There's a backstory there, and as you go through the game, that backstory slowly unravels, and you begin to realize why they have the relationship that they do. It's messy, but it's also interesting, especially because it shows us this new fatherly side to Barry, which we also see in his relationship with Natalia, this frightened little girl. They do a lot of interesting things with Natalia, which I can't really get into without spoiling. The least interesting character to me personally was Claire, and it's not even that she was badly written or anything, she was just less compelling to me because we already know Claire. All of the characters were handled well for the most part, and the story as a whole was very interesting. However, the characters aren't just here to serve the story, they're also here to serve the gameplay. Revelations 2 came out at the peak of co-op Resident Evil, and as such, this game was heavily based around co-op as well, but it did it in a way that was very different from RE5 and RE6. Those games were co-op shooters, where both players had the same capabilities. You played the same, there was no difference between the two characters. Revelations 2, on the other hand, feels much more like Resident Evil 0 in this regard. Only Claire and Barry are able to use guns, and their co-op partners, Moira and Natalia, are not able to. This leads to each character playing very differently, and giving each of them their own assigned roles. Claire and Barry are there to do the fighting, while Moira and Natalia are there to do everything else. I compare this to Resident Evil 0 because if you play this game by yourself, you're able to freely switch from character to character. So you could go from playing as Claire and switch to Moira, or when you're playing as Barry, you could switch to Natalia and then back to Barry. It's all up to you. This is the only Resident Evil game where this is a thing, and I found it to be pretty unique. I can see it being pretty annoying if you're playing with a friend and you want to switch characters but your friend doesn't want to switch, but overall it's a very good system in general. It all flows very well. I also compare this to RE0 because of the horror elements that are found in the game. This game was built on the same engine that RE6 was built on, so when you're playing this game, you do feel a lot of similarities to that gameplay-wise. But this game really does feel like it was trying to find a balance between action and horror, unlike RE6. Was it successful in that regard? Not really, because I didn't find this game scary to play. Like, this is not RE1, RE2 levels of horror at all. But I still do congratulate it for actually trying to add some sort of horror coat of paint. It has much more Resident Evil DNA in it than RE6 ever had. which is kinda crazy for a spin-off. There's a lot more resource management and inventory management in this game than RE6, and you can't just perform wrestling moves on all the zombies. There were some moments where I actually found myself running low on ammo, and there were some points where the game actually motivates you to run away and not kill every enemy. Very classic Resident Evil. But of course, there's also the elements of action in it. You're able to melee an enemy whenever you stun them, like in RE4, and there are some moments where they swarm you with hordes of enemies. This game also has a skill tree system, where every time you complete a level, you're given skill points that you can invest into a large skill tree. Not every character has their own skill tree or anything. It's just one large skill tree with a bunch of skills, each skill applying to a certain character, or in some cases even both characters. Think of it like a scaled down version of Resident Evil 6. Honestly, the gameplay of Revelations 2 is actually very solid. It's not perfect, obviously. Some of the gunplay does feel a bit stiff, but it's still very solid. It actually reminds me a lot of RE4 Remake, which, funnily enough, the director of this game also worked on RE4 Remake. The gameplay of this game shines even more in Raid mode. Raid mode is pretty much the Revelations equivalent of Mercenaries. An extra, fun, arcadey game mode. And honestly, I like this just as much, if not more, than the Mercenaries. While the Mercenaries is a horde mode that's heavily based around combos and gaining points, Raid mode is much more about objectives. And there's a lot more variety in it too. In Raid mode, you have a ton of stages to go through. All of them either being repurposed areas from the campaign, or even some areas from Resident Evil 6, cause, you know, they have the assets, might as well port it over. Every level has its own objective, most of them being about eliminating all of the BOWs in your way, but there's also some missions where, say, you have to defend an objective. After you clear a mission, you earn XP, new guns, modifications for those guns that you can use to modify the stats of them, in-game currency, which you can use to buy some stuff, and skill points, which you can use to upgrade your character. There's a ton of characters to pick from in this game, and each of these characters have their own playstyles, their own skills. This mode's a lot of fun, there's a lot to it, and it's even more fun if you play it in co-op, regardless of whether or not you play it with a friend or a random person. It's still fun. Resident Evil Revelations 2 isn't talked about nearly enough for the amount of fun that's in this game. It's not just a fun game, there's a lot of fun to be had. Not only is there a decently sized campaign, but there's also 2 DLCs for you to play through, a bunch of extra content for you to unlock and collectibles for you to look for, and the extensive raid mode. All of it being a blast to play whether you're playing it with a friend or by yourself. It's honestly up there as one of my favorite Resident Evil games. So if you are a Resident Evil fan that's thirsty for more Resident Evil and you've never played this game, get it. It's a great game, and since the game is divided into multiple different episodes, it's extremely cheap nowadays. So what are you waiting for? Go pick the game up. Thanks for watching, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.